The summer evening sky over Munich was painted in shades of orange and violet as more than 40,000 fans filled the massive Olympic Stadium. Excitement rippled through the crowd like a current, each cheer, each clap building into a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the concrete beneath their feet. They had come for one reason, to see Freddie Mercury and Queen perform live, an experience that had already become legendary across Europe. For many in the audience, it was not just a concert, it was a once-in-a-lifetime communion with music that defined their generation. Freddie appeared on stage in his iconic white tank top and tight-fitting jeans, his silhouette already commanding. The sea of people before a single note escaped his lips. His every movement carried the presence of a man larger than life, yet deeply human in his ability to connect. As the first chords of One Vision thundered from Brian May's guitar, the crowd erupted in an explosion of energy, their voices uniting in deafening cheers. It was the kind of electricity only Freddie could summon, half rock star, half spiritual leader guiding his congregation. The older fans in the audience, men and women now in their 50s and 60s, found themselves swept back in time, remembering the first time they'd heard Queen on vinyl decades earlier. Couples held hands, fathers pointed proudly to the stage, while sons and daughters cheered, and veterans of the band's earliest days felt tears gathering in their eyes. Freddie's presence wasn't just entertainment, it was memory, nostalgia, and the power of youth reignited in their hearts. What nobody in that enormous stadium knew was that among them sat a fragile child, clinging to life and to one last dream. His name was Lukas, only 8 years old, and though he was small and frail, tonight he glowed with anticipation brighter than anyone around him. His mother had carried him through the gates, whispering in his ear that his hero would soon be singing. To Lukas, Freddie Mercury wasn't just a performer, he was hope, courage, and joy personified. As Queen blazed through their opening numbers, Tie Your Mother Down and 7 Seas of Rye, the boy sang softly into a toy microphone he held tightly in his hands. He could barely be heard, yet the devotion in his eyes was unmistakable. His mother kept one arm around him protectively, her heart torn between overwhelming love and the silent dread of knowing why this night had to be so special. Lukas had asked for only one thing, to see Freddie Mercury live before it was too late. From the stage, Freddie scanned the endless crowd with those piercing eyes of his. He had a gift for noticing individuals in a sea of thousands, for sensing when someone out there needed him more than anyone else. And on this night, though he did not yet realize it, his gaze would soon fall on Lukas, a meeting that would transform the concert into something unforgettable, something sacred. In the very front row, pressed against the barricade that separated the sea of people from the towering stage, sat little Lukas. His body was weak, his skin pale from the long battle with leukemia that had consumed most of his young life. Yet tonight, wrapped in a too large Queen t-shirt that nearly swallowed his frame, he seemed to glow with a strength that no doctor could explain. His tiny paper crown, carefully cut and decorated with golden foil by his sister at home, rested slightly crooked on his head. In his hands, he clutched a toy microphone, a symbol of the dream that carried him here. His mother, Anna, never stopped watching him. Every movement of his chest, every breath was counted silently in her mind. Doctors had told her weeks ago that Lukas didn't have much time left, but she refused to let despair win. When he whispered, "Mama, I just want to see Freddie," she had moved mountains. She begged, borrowed, and leaned on friends until by what felt like divine grace, she found tickets in the very front row. She had carried him herself into the stadium, praying silently that his small heart would withstand the excitement. Around them, thousands of fans were laughing, singing, and raising their arms in unison, unaware of the quiet miracle unfolding. Just feet away, The crowd was here for spectacle, but Anna was here for closure, for one last chance to give her son a memory powerful enough to outshine his pain. She smoothed his hair, kissed the top of his head, and whispered, "Freddie, we'll see you, darling. He'll sing just for you." Lucas's lips curled into a faint smile, his eyes never leaving the stage as the band transitioned into Somebody to Love. Lucas's frail voice joined Freddie's from below the stage. It was a whisper compared to the thunder rolling through the speakers, but to his mother, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. His lips formed every word, even as his breathing grew heavy. He didn't just know the lyrics, he lived them. For a child who had spent more time in hospital beds than playgrounds, the idea of finding somebody, something, to love had always meant Freddie's music. A security guard standing nearby noticed Lucas, his small arms waving weakly in rhythm. Normally, front row fans were rambunctious, jumping, screaming, fighting for attention. But this little boy was different. There was fragility in his movements, yet also a courage that struck the guard deep in his chest. He turned his eyes toward the stage, wondering if Freddie would notice the child before the night ended. Something inside him hoped, almost prayed, that the singer's eyes would find that little crown in the sea of faces. And indeed, they would. For though Freddie Mercury was commanding the entire stadium with the voice of a lion, he had the heart of a man who never ignored those who needed him most. The spotlight of destiny was slowly moving toward Lucas, and soon the boy's small wish would collide with Freddie's boundless compassion, altering the course of the night in a way no one present would ever forget. As the final chords of Somebody to Love echoed into the night, Freddie walked slowly across the stage, towel in hand, dabbing the sweat from his brow. He loved these pauses between songs, moments when he could look out into the ocean of faces and feel the pulse of the crowd. Normally, his eyes would dart from one corner to another, teasing fans, blowing kisses, pointing his microphone to hear their roaring voices echo back. But this time, his gaze settled somewhere near the very front row on a fragile figure wearing a paper crown, held steady by the loving arm of his mother. Something in Freddie's chest tightened. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was that sixth sense he carried, but he knew instantly that the boy was not like the others. His eyes, large, bright, yet undeniably tired, were locked on him with an intensity that pierced through the chaos of lights and sound. Freddie tilted his head slightly, studying the child, before stepping closer to the edge of the stage. The band behind him waited, unsure of what he was about to do. Anna, realizing that Freddie's eyes had fallen on her son, felt her heart leap into her throat. Without thinking, she lifted Lucas a little higher, tears brimming in her eyes. The boy clutched his toy microphone and whispered so faintly that only his mother heard, "Mama, he sees me." It was a whisper filled with awe, hope, and the kind of joy only a dying child could feel in the presence of his hero. Anna mouthed silently toward Freddie, desperate for him to understand. "He's sick. He loves you." At first, Freddie blinked, unsure if he had read her lips correctly. But when she repeated the words, her face shining with desperation, the weight of it hit him like a blow. The crowd, sensing something unusual, grew quieter. Conversations hushed, applause faded, and a wave of curiosity passed across 40,000 people as they followed Freddie's gaze toward the child in the front row. The electricity of the concert shifted into something more intimate, more fragile, as though everyone suddenly realized they were part of a moment larger than the show itself. The musicians looked at Freddie, waiting for his cue to begin the next song, but he raised his hand, signaling them to hold. The silence deepened. With his microphone lowered, he stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his eyes locked on Lucas. Finally, he lifted the mic back to his lips and, with uncharacteristic gentleness, spoke. "What's your name, darling?" His voice, normally booming with theatrical power, was soft and tender, carrying clearly through the hushed stadium. The boy, trembling in his mother's arms, lifted his tiny microphone and whispered into it, "Lukas." The sound was barely audible, yet somehow, in the stillness, it seemed to echo across the arena like a sacred word. 40,000 people stood in complete silence, united in a collective breath. In that instant, the rock concert was no longer about music, lights, or spectacle. It had become a prayer, a fragile connection between a superstar and a child whose time was running out. The crowd, which only moments earlier had been roaring with excitement, now stood frozen in a silence so complete that even the wind seemed to pause. 40,000 people, shoulder to shoulder, held their breath as Freddie Mercury leaned forward at the edge of the stage, his eyes fixed on the frail boy who had just whispered his name. In that vast stadium, where voices usually merged into a deafening wall of sound, the hush was so profound that you could hear the faint click of cameras and the distant hum of amplifiers waiting for their cue. It was as though time itself had stopped. Freddie rested one hand on the microphone stand, his other hand gently pressed against his chest. He looked down at Lukas with an intensity that carried both strength and compassion. This wasn't Freddie Mercury the showman, the flamboyant icon, who strutted across stages with unshakable confidence. This was Freddie the man, stripped of all pretense, moved by the sight of a child whose courage eclipsed every spotlight shining on that stage. His voice, when it returned, was softer than anyone had ever heard from him. "Lukas, darling, would you like to come up here with me?" A murmur swept through the audience, followed by gasps. Security guards exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't part of the plan, and bringing a fragile child onto a stage surrounded by tens of thousands of screaming fans was unheard of. But Freddie raised his hand firmly, halting them before they could intervene. "Bring him to me," he insisted, his tone carrying both authority and urgency. Those words were not just a request, they were a command from a man whose heart had already decided what was right. Anna, trembling, held Lukas tighter. For a moment, fear clashed with hope in her eyes. She knew her son's body was weak, that even the short journey onto the stage could exhaust him. But when Lukas tugged gently at her sleeve and whispered, "Mama, please," she nodded through her tears. A crew member carefully approached, lifting the boy with the tenderness of someone carrying something sacred. Slowly, step by step, Lukas was brought toward the man he had dreamed of meeting. The crowd erupted in applause, not the usual thunderous, chaotic cheers, but a softer, reverent wave of sound that resembled the clapping of a congregation during a prayer. Grown men wiped their eyes, women embraced each other tightly. Even the security guards, hardened by years of controlling rowdy concerts, felt a lump in their throats as they watched the fragile boy being carried toward Freddie Mercury. For the first time that evening, the spectacle of rock and roll had given way to something infinitely more profound, pure human compassion. When Lukas finally reached the stage, Freddie stepped down from the platform to meet him halfway, as if lowering himself from the pedestal of legend to the ground of humanity. He extended his arms, and the boy, small and trembling, leaned into him. Freddie lifted him gently, adjusting the paper crown that slipped slightly over his forehead, and cradled him as though he were the most precious being in the world. The sight of the larger-than-life star holding the fragile child sent a tidal wave of emotion through the crowd. In that moment, 40,000 people knew they were no longer watching a concert. They were witnessing history. The stadium lights glistened on Freddie's face as he held Lukas in his arms, and for the first time in the entire show, the man who could command thousands with a single gesture seemed almost fragile himself. The boy's small body rested against his chest, his tiny hand clutching the toy microphone with all the strength he could muster. Freddie bent his head, whispered something only Lukas could hear, and the child smiled faintly, a smile so pure and delicate that it melted even the hardest hearts in the audience. When Freddie turned back to the crowd, the weight of what he was carrying was not just physical. He was holding a child whose time was measured in days, maybe hours, and yet, under the glaring lights and before tens of thousands of strangers, Freddie carried him as though he were carrying the crown jewels. The paper crown on Lukas's head slipped slightly, and Freddie, with the tenderness of a father, adjusted it carefully. That simple gesture, a superstar fixing a dying boy's paper crown, sent ripples of tears through the entire arena. The band, silent and waiting, watched in awe. Even Brian May and Roger Taylor, men who had shared countless stages with Freddie, felt their throats tighten. This wasn't part of the set list, nor could it have been rehearsed. It was a moment born purely of compassion, and it radiated through every amplifier, every speaker, and into the very souls of the audience. Freddie walked slowly toward the piano, the child still in his arms, and the spotlight followed their every step. He sat down carefully, positioning Lukas gently on his lap. The boy, though exhausted, leaned, his head against Freddie's chest, his paper crown tilting once more as though even it could feel the weight of the moment. Freddie looked at him and then at the audience, his voice breaking as he spoke into the microphone. "Tonight, Lukas will help me sing this one, and we will sing it together for every child who needs a little bit of magic." The crowd, who had been silent, erupted into applause, not the wild, frenzied applause of a rock concert, but something deeper, something reverent. It was as if 40,000 people were clapping not just for Freddie, but for the courage of a boy whose dream had carried him into this sacred moment. Many in the audience pressed their hands to their hearts, tears streaming freely. They weren't just spectators anymore. They were participants in something holy. As Freddie placed his fingers on the piano keys, the first delicate chords of "Love of My Life" floated into the night. The hush that followed was almost unbearable, as though the entire stadium had transformed into a cathedral. And at the very center of it all, a dying child and a rock legend prepared to sing, their voices about to weave together in a way that no one there would ever forget. The first notes of "Love of My Life" drifted softly from Freddie's piano, and instantly the crowd recognized it. This was the song of devotion, the one he often dedicated to the audience, letting them sing back to him as if they were the true owners of the melody. But tonight, it carried a new weight. Sitting on Freddie's lap, Lukas lifted his toy microphone, his tiny lips mouthing the words, his frail voice barely rising above a whisper. Freddie leaned in close, their heads almost touching, and began to sing with a gentleness that nobody had ever heard from him before. At first, only Freddie's voice carried through the stadium, rich, warm, tender. But then something miraculous happened. As Lukas softly sang along, the sound of his fragile voice blended into Freddie's. The microphones didn't need to amplify him. His presence alone was enough. The boy's effort, though quiet, was felt by everyone watching. The sight of a child fighting to sing his favorite song alongside his hero transformed the performance into something divine. Slowly, the audience began to join in. 40,000 voices, hesitant at first, rose together in a hushed chorus. It wasn't the usual booming sing-along of a Queen concert, but a soft, reverent harmony, like a lullaby sung by a congregation. Men who had once cheered wildly now wiped their eyes. Women clutched their loved ones closer. Even the security guards, often stoic and detached, found themselves mouthing the lyrics through tears. Freddie's eyes glistened as he looked down at Lukas, who was giving everything he had to stay awake and keep singing. With one hand, Freddie continued to play the piano. With the other, he held the boy against him, steadying him as though to say, "You are not alone, I am with you." His voice trembled but never broke, carrying each line like a prayer offered for the child in his arms. By the time the chorus came, the entire stadium was singing. 40,000 voices surrounded Freddie and Lukas, lifting them on a wave of sound so powerful it seemed to shake the heavens themselves. "Love of my life, don't leave me." The words, once a romantic ballad, became a plea for the child's life, an anthem of compassion that turned rock and roll into sacred liturgy. Tears fell freely from Freddie's face as he kissed the crown on Lukas's head and sang the final lines with his whole soul. In that moment, the concert ceased to be entertainment. It was no longer about fame, spectacle, or performance. It was a prayer, an act of pure love, shared by a rock star, a dying child, and 40,000 witnesses who would carry that memory in their hearts forever. When the last chord of "Love of My Life" faded into the night air, silence lingered. For a heartbeat, as if the universe itself refused to interrupt what had just happened. Then slowly, the stadium erupted, not with the usual thunderous roar of a rock concert, but with an applause that was soft, reverent, and unending. 40,000 people stood on their feet, clapping in unison, their faces streaked with tears. They weren't cheering for spectacle. They were honoring courage, love, and the bond between a child and his hero. Freddie, still holding Lukas in his arms, stood from the piano and walked to the center of the stage. His chest rose and fell heavily, his face wet from tears that glistened in the spotlight. He raised the microphone, but his voice cracked before he could speak. The audience waited, breathless, until finally he found the strength. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice trembling, "I want you to meet my friend Lukas. He is the bravest boy I have ever known." The words sent another wave of emotion through the crowd. Mothers hugged their children tighter, fathers bowed their heads in respect. Strangers reached for each other's hands, united in a collective experience that felt more like a spiritual gathering than a rock concert. The applause swelled again, and this time it was mixed with sobs, cheers, and shouts of encouragement. For the little boy, who managed to lift his toy microphone and wave weakly at the audience. When the concert finally resumed, Freddie was no longer the same. He sang the next songs with a voice that trembled at times, yet carried even more power than before. Every lyric seemed dedicated to Lukas, every note heavy with meaning. The audience felt it too. People who had come to dance and sing along now stood still, their hearts marked forever by what they had witnessed. The show ended with fireworks and thunderous music, but the true explosion that night had been of love and compassion. Back in her seat, Anna held her son tightly as the lights dimmed. Lukas was exhausted, his small body drained, yet his eyes sparkled in a way she hadn't seen for months. "Mama," he whispered faintly, "Freddie sang with me." She kissed his forehead, tears streaming down her face, and whispered back, "Yes, darling, you made him proud." In her heart, she knew this memory would carry them both through whatever came next. Doctors had predicted that Lukas would not survive the week, but something extraordinary happened after that night. Perhaps it was adrenaline, perhaps it was the wave of love from 40,000 strangers, or perhaps it was the magic of his dream fulfilled. Whatever it was, Lukas lived not for days, but for months. Each morning he woke with a strength no one could explain, always asking to rewatch Queen's performances on their old VHS tapes, wearing his paper crown with pride. For Freddie, the night in Munich also left a scar of beauty on his soul. He spoke little about it publicly, but close friends later recalled that he carried the memory of Lukas with him for years. He often reminded himself and others that fame was nothing if it couldn't be used to lift someone up. "That boy reminded me," he once told a confidant, "that music is not about applause, it's about love." When Lukas eventually passed away peacefully in his sleep months later, he did so wearing a small replica of Freddie's crown. At his funeral, his mother played "Love of My Life," the song that had given him his happiest memory. Those who had been at the concert said they could still feel the echo of 40,000 voices gently carrying the boy to his rest. It wasn't an ending. It was a continuation of the love that had filled the stadium that night. And so, the story lived on. Among Queen fans, the tale of Freddie stopping a concert for a child spread like legend. For those who were there, it became the defining memory of their lives. And for Freddie, it was a reminder that even in the grandest stages of the world, the greatest performance of all was not the one sung with perfect notes, but the one sung with compassion. A performance that left 40,000 people in tears and gave one little boy the strength to keep smiling until the very end.